In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where every gesture carries meaning and every tradition holds weight, there exists a mystery that has puzzled royal watchers for years. Among the stoic figures of the Queen's Guard, one man stands apart, not for his military bearing or unwavering discipline, but for something far more personal and deeply hidden. His name is James Mitchell, and for 7 years he has never once removed his pristine white ceremonial gloves in the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales. Not during state dinners, not during private security briefings, not even during the informal moments when protocol relaxes, and humanity shows through the royal facade.
What lies beneath those gloves is a story of sacrifice, love, and a promise made in the darkest of times. A secret so profound that it has shaped not only his service to the crown, but his very soul.
This is not just the story of a guard's devotion to duty, but of how a single moment can define a lifetime, and how the deepest acts of love often remain forever hidden from the world.
The truth behind James Mitchell's white gloves will break your heart and restore your faith in the power of human connection, even within the rigid walls of royal protocol. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Windsor Castle as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 28, he had already served 5 years in the Queen's Guard, but today felt different. Today, he would meet Catherine for the first time in his official capacity as her newly assigned personal protection officer. James had heard the stories, of course. The entire palace staff spoke of the princess with genuine affection. Her warmth, her ability to make even the most formal occasions feel personal, and her uncanny knack for remembering details about everyone she met. But as he stood in the corridor outside her private office, James felt an unusual flutter of nervousness. The door opened, and Catherine emerged with her private secretary, discussing the day's schedule in animated tones. When she looked up and saw James, her face brightened with that famous smile that had graced countless magazine covers. "You must be James," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard wonderful things about your service record." James stepped forward, his training taking over as he prepared for the formal introduction. But as he reached out to shake her hand, something extraordinary happened. Catherine's fingers were bare, no gloves, no rings except her wedding band, and as their hands met, James felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly knocked him off balance. There, on the back of Catherine's right hand, was a small, crescent-shaped scar, faded with time but unmistakable to James's eyes. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the professional composure he had cultivated over years of royal service threatened to crumble entirely. Catherine noticed his hesitation immediately. Her eyes, kind and perceptive, searched his face with concern. "Is everything all right?" James recovered quickly, his military training reasserting itself. "Of course, Your Highness. It's an honor to serve." But even as he spoke the formal words, his mind was reeling. The scar on her hand was identical to one he knew intimately, one that held memories too painful and too precious to ever forget. As Catherine continued with her day, James maintained his professional distance, but internally he was transported back 15 years to a small hospital in Manchester, where a 13-year-old boy named James Mitchell had made a promise that would echo through the rest of his life. The Manchester Children's Hospital had been James's second home for 6 months. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia had turned his world upside down, transforming him from an active teenager into a pale, weak shell of his former self. The chemotherapy had stolen his hair, his energy, and nearly his hope. But in that sterile ward, surrounded by beeping machines and the constant hum of medical equipment, he had found something unexpected: friendship. Her name was Kate Middleton then, just Kate. A 13-year-old girl from Berkshire who had been admitted for reconstructive surgery after a severe accident during a family skiing trip. The accident had left her with multiple fractures, and that distinctive crescent-shaped scar on her hand, a permanent reminder of the metal edge that had torn through her skin during the fall. Kate had been James's roommate's sister, visiting daily and gradually becoming a fixture in the children's ward. While her brother recovered from his own injuries, Kate had taken it upon herself to befriend the other young patients, bringing them books, playing card games, and simply listening when they needed to talk. James remembered the day they first truly connected. He had been particularly sick after a round of treatment, unable to keep food down and feeling more alone than ever. His parents lived 3 hours away and could only visit on weekends, leaving him with long stretches of solitude that seemed to amplify every fear and uncertainty about his future. Kate had appeared in his doorway that evening, holding a worn copy of The Chronicles of Narnia and wearing that same warm smile that would later charm the world. "Mind if I read to you?" she had asked. "I've been told I do excellent character voices." What followed were weeks of unexpected friendship. Kate would arrive each afternoon after visiting her brother, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside James's bed, with whatever book they were working through together. She told him stories about her life in Berkshire, her dreams of studying art history, and her hopes for the future. In return, James shared his love of military history, his dream of serving his country, and his growing fear that he might not live to see his 14th birthday. It was Kate who held his hand during the worst of the treatments. It was Kate who celebrated with him when his white blood cell counts began to improve. And it was Kate who made him promise, on her last day before returning home, that he would never give up on his dreams. "Promise me," she had said, her hand, scarred but warm, clasping his. "Promise me you'll become everything you want to be. Promise me you'll serve your country with honor, and that you'll never forget that someone believes in you completely." James had promised, his 13-year-old voice cracking with emotion. He had promised, and Kate had kissed his forehead gently before walking out of his life forever, or so he had thought. They had exchanged letters for a few months after her brother's recovery, but as teenagers do, they had gradually lost touch. Kate went on to finish school and eventually attend St. Cole Andrews University. James went into remission, completed his treatment, and threw himself into his education and physical training with the single-minded determination of someone who had been given a second chance at life. He had followed her story in the newspapers, of course. When Kate Middleton became Prince William's girlfriend, James had felt a surge of pride for the girl who had once read him stories in a hospital bed. When she became Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, he had watched the royal wedding with tears in his eyes, remembering the 13-year-old who had believed in his dreams when he could barely believe in his own survival. But never, in all his years of military service and his eventual placement in the Queen's Guard, had James imagined that their paths would cross again. Never had he dreamed that the scared boy who had held hands with Kate Middleton would one day be trusted with protecting Catherine, Princess of Wales. Now, standing guard outside her private apartments, James was overwhelmed by the weight of that childhood promise and the impossible situation it had created. How could he tell her who he was? How could he explain that beneath his formal exterior lived the same boy she had comforted all those years ago? And how could he possibly do his job, maintaining professional distance and emotional detachment, when every instinct screamed at him to thank her for saving his life in ways she would never fully understand? The answer, James realized with growing certainty, was simple. He couldn't. The revelation would compromise his position, potentially embarrass the princess, and destroy the professional relationship that was essential to his role as her protector. The boy who had made that promise in the hospital was not the same person as the royal guard who stood here now, and mixing those identities would serve no one. So James made a different kind of promise that first day. He would serve Catherine with every fibre of his being, protecting her not just as his duty demanded, but with the fierce loyalty of someone who owed her a debt that could never be repaid. He would carry their shared past as a secret honor, letting it strengthen his resolve, without ever burdening her with the knowledge of who he had once been. And he would never, ever remove his white ceremonial gloves in her presence, because beneath those gloves on the back of his right hand was a matching scar, a thin crescent-shaped mark where Kate Middleton had once held his hand during a blood draw that had gone wrong, her own scarred hand gripping his so tightly that her ring, a simple band she had worn even then, had pressed into his skin, leaving its permanent mark. The scars were identical, mirror images of shared pain and healing. But while Catherine's scar was a reminder of an accident overcome, James's was something far more complex. A physical connection to the person who had taught him to hope when hope seemed impossible. And a constant reminder of the promise that had shaped every choice he had made since. As the days turned into weeks, James settled into his role with remarkable skill. His military record had been exemplary, but his performance as Catherine's protection officer exceeded even the highest expectations. He seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, positioned himself with an intuitive understanding of her comfort zones, and demonstrated a level of professional dedication that impressed even the most senior palace staff. Catherine, for her part, appreciated James's quiet competence. Unlike some of her previous security details, he never made her feel like she was under surveillance. Instead, he created a bubble of safety that was somehow both protective and unobtrusive. She found herself relaxing around him in ways that surprised her, trusting his judgment implicitly, even though they had only worked together for a short time. There were moments when Catherine would catch James looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something deeper than professional assessment, warmer than formal respect. When she would meet his eyes, he would immediately resume his neutral expression, but she was left with the lingering sense that there was more to James Mitchell than his impeccable service record revealed. The first real test of their professional relationship came during a state visit from the Norwegian royal family. The occasion required multiple wardrobe changes, complex security arrangements, and hours of formal ceremonies where the slightest mistake could create an international incident. James had studied the itinerary meticulously, coordinating with other security teams and palace staff to ensure every detail was perfect. But as Catherine prepared for the final reception of the evening, disaster struck in the form of a wardrobe malfunction that threatened to derail the entire event. The clasp on Catherine's necklace, a priceless sapphire and diamond piece that had belonged to Diana, had broken just minutes before she was due to greet the Norwegian queen. The palace's jewelry specialists were nowhere to be found, and Catherine's ladies-in-waiting were in near panic as they tried unsuccessfully to repair the delicate mechanism. James watched the crisis unfold from his position by the door, his trained mind automatically calculating solutions. The necklace was essential to Catherine's formal outfit, and its absence would be noticed and commented upon by every royal watcher and fashion journalist present. But more than that, he could see that Catherine herself was genuinely distressed by the situation. Without conscious thought, James stepped forward. "Your Highness, may I?" Catherine looked up in surprise. It was highly irregular for a security officer to involve himself in personal matters, but there was something in James's tone, confident, gentle, and utterly trustworthy, that made her nod immediately. James approached the dressing table where the broken necklace lay, his movements careful and precise. As Catherine's ladies-in-waiting watched in amazement, he examined the clasp with the expertise of someone who understood delicate mechanisms. His fingers, still gloved in their ceremonial white, worked with surprising dexterity to realign the tiny components. "I spent a summer working in my uncle's watch repair shop," he explained quietly, sensing Catherine's curiosity about his unexpected skill. "Small mechanisms have always made sense to me." Within minutes, he had the necklace functioning perfectly again. As he prepared to step back, Catherine turned to face him, lifting her hair so he could fasten the clasp around her neck. It was an intimate gesture, the kind of personal service that would normally be performed by a lady-in-waiting or personal dresser. But in that moment, with time running short and Catherine's trust evident in her posture, James found himself in a position he had never anticipated. Close enough to smell her perfume, close enough to see the fine line of freckles along her neckline, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. His gloved fingers worked carefully with the clasp, conscious of the precious metal and stones, but even more conscious of the trust Catherine was placing in him. When the necklace was secure, she turned to face him again, her eyes bright with relief, and something deeper, a recognition that James had stepped beyond the bounds of his official role to help her in a moment of genuine need. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James stepped back immediately, resuming his professional posture, but the moment lingered between them like a bridge built across the formal distance that usually defined their interactions. For just an instant, they had connected as simply two people helping each other, and both were changed by it. As Catherine swept into the reception, radiant and confident with Diana's sapphires gleaming at her throat, James took his position among the other security personnel. But his hands were trembling slightly inside his white gloves, and his heart was beating faster than any royal protection training had prepared him for. The evening was a complete success, with Catherine receiving praise from dignitaries and press alike for her grace and elegance. But for James, the triumph was overshadowed by a growing realization that his feelings for Catherine were becoming far more complex than appropriate for a member of her security detail. He had entered this position determined to serve her from a distance, honoring their shared past while maintaining complete professionalism. But Catherine herself, her warmth, her intelligence, her genuine kindness to everyone around her, was making that emotional distance increasingly difficult to maintain. That night, alone in his quarters, James sat on the edge of his bed and slowly removed his white gloves. The crescent-shaped scar on his right hand caught the lamplight, as it had every night for 15 years. He traced its outline with his left index finger, remembering the 13-year-old girl who had held his hand when he was most afraid, and wondering how he was supposed to reconcile that memory with the reality of the woman he now served. The Catherine he protected was everything the Kate he remembered had promised to become: compassionate, intelligent, dedicated to using her position to help others. But she was also William's wife, the mother of future monarchs, and someone whose life existed in a stratosphere far removed from anything James could ever be part of. His promise to never remove his gloves in her presence had seemed simple at first, a way to keep their shared past safely hidden. But now he understood that the gloves were protecting far more than just a matching scar. They were hiding hands that trembled when he was near her, hands that wanted to comfort her when she was tired, hands that had to remain professionally distant, even as his heart grew increasingly personal in its devotion. James pressed his palms together, covering both scars, and made a new promise to himself. He would find a way to serve Catherine with complete dedication while keeping his growing feelings locked away as securely as the secret of their shared past. He would be the guard she needed, not the boy who remembered her kindness, or the man who was falling in love with her from behind a barrier of protocol and impossible circumstances. But promises, James was beginning to learn, were easier to make than to keep, especially when the person you're trying to protect is the same person who once taught you how to hope, and who continues to embody every dream you've ever dared to dream. The weeks that followed the Norwegian reception established a new rhythm in James's relationship with Catherine. She had begun to rely on him for more than just security, occasionally asking his opinion on schedules, seeking his insight about potential risks at various events, and even making casual conversation during the quiet moments between official engagements. James found himself walking an increasingly delicate line. His professional performance remained flawless, but privately, he was struggling with the growing intimacy of their working relationship. Every shared glance, every moment of casual conversation, every instance where Catherine treated him as more than just another member of her staff, made it harder to maintain the emotional distance he knew was essential. The situation became more complicated on a crisp November morning, when Catherine announced that she wanted to make an unscheduled visit to the Manchester Children's Hospital. The same hospital where James had received his cancer treatment 15 years earlier. "I know it's not on the official calendar," Catherine explained to her private secretary as James stood nearby, his heart racing beneath his composed exterior. "But I received a letter from a young patient there, and something about it just spoke to me. I'd like to arrange a visit as soon as possible." James listened to the conversation with growing dread and anticipation. The hospital held so many memories, of pain and fear, but also of hope and healing, and most importantly, of Kate Middleton reading to him in that sterile room. The thought of returning there with Catherine, of watching her interact with children facing the same struggles he had once faced, was both thrilling and terrifying. As Catherine's protection officer, James would naturally accompany her on the visit. He would walk the same corridors where he had once shuffled in hospital slippers, see the same rooms where he had fought for his life, and perhaps even meet some of the same staff members who had cared for him during his treatment. But more than that, he would watch Catherine work her magic with the young patients, knowing that she had once been that same source of light and hope for him. The irony was almost too much to bear. He would be protecting the woman who had once protected his spirit during the darkest period of his life. The visit was scheduled for the following week, and James threw himself into the security preparations with unusual intensity. He studied the hospital's layout with obsessive attention to detail, coordinated with local police and hospital security, and reviewed every aspect of the planned itinerary multiple times. His colleagues attributed his thoroughness to professional dedication, but James knew the truth. He was preparing for one of the most emotionally challenging days of his life. On the morning of the visit, James dressed with particular care, ensuring his uniform was perfect and his white gloves were spotless. As they drove through Manchester's familiar streets, Catherine chatted easily with her private secretary about the planned activities, but James was lost in memories of ambulance rides along these same roads. The Manchester Children's Hospital looked much the same as James remembered, though some areas had been renovated and modernised. As their car pulled up to the main entrance, James felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. This place had been his whole world for 6 months, the setting for the most formative experience of his life. Catherine emerged from the car with her characteristic grace, immediately brightening as she saw the small crowd of hospital staff and local officials waiting to greet her. James took his position slightly behind and to her right, his trained eyes scanning for potential security issues, but his heart was pounding with recognition and remembrance. The hospital's chief executive, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, stepped forward to welcome Catherine. James started slightly at the familiar surname. No relation, of course, but it reminded him of how small and interconnected the world could sometimes feel.
Your Royal Highness, Doctor,
Mitchell said warmly. "We are absolutely honored by your visit. The children have been talking about nothing else for days." Catherine's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "The honor is entirely mine. I understand you have some very brave young patients here who could use a bit of royal attention. As they moved through the hospital's corridors, James found himself overwhelmed by sensory memories. The smell of disinfectant and floor polish, the soft sound of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the distant hum of medical equipment, all of it transported him back to his 13-year-old self, bold and weak, but determined to survive. Their first stop was the pediatric oncology ward, and James had to work hard to maintain his professional demeanor as they walked past rooms that looked exactly like the one where he had spent 6 months of his life. Some were occupied by young patients in various stages of treatment, their heads covered by colorful scarves or completely bald from chemotherapy. Catherine moved from room to room with remarkable skill, adapting her approach to each child's condition and personality. With the shy ones, she sat quietly and let them warm up to her gradually. With the more outgoing patients, she engaged in animated conversations about their hobbies, their families, and their dreams for the future. James watched it all with growing amazement and a deep, familiar ache in his chest. This was exactly what Kate Middleton had done for him 15 years ago, created moments of normalcy and hope in a place defined by illness and uncertainty. Watching Catherine work with these children was like watching his own memories come to life, except now he was seeing it from the outside, understanding for the first time how deliberate and skillful Kate's kindness had been. In one room, they met 8-year-old Tommy, a leukemia patient who was midway through his treatment. Tommy was having a particularly difficult day, weak from his latest round of chemotherapy and homesick for his family in Liverpool. He barely looked up when Catherine entered his room, his small form huddled under a pile of blankets. Catherine didn't try to force conversation. Instead, she settled into the chair beside his bed, the same type of uncomfortable chair Kate had sat in all those years ago, and simply waited. After a few minutes, Tommy peeked out from his blankets, curious about this elegantly dressed woman who was content to sit quietly in his room. "Are you really a princess?" Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from treatment. Catherine smiled gently. "I am. But right now, I'm just Catherine. And I'm here because I wanted to meet you. I heard you're very brave." Tommy considered this information seriously. "I don't feel brave. I feel scared most of the time." "You know what?" Catherine said, leaning slightly closer. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what you need to do, even when you're scared. And you're here, fighting to get better, even though it's hard and scary. That's the bravest thing anyone can do." James had to look away, his throat tight with emotion. Those words, almost exactly the words Kate had spoken to him when he had confessed his own fears about treatment, hit him with the force of a physical blow. The connection between past and present, between the girl who had comforted him and the woman who was now comforting Tommy, was too powerful to ignore. As Catherine continued talking with Tommy, sharing stories about her own children, and encouraging him to talk about his interests, James found himself remembering every detail of his own hospital conversations with Kate. The way she had listened to his fears about dying, his anger at his illness, his desperate hope for a future he wasn't sure he would live to see. "I want to be a soldier when I grow up," Tommy told Catherine, his eyes growing brighter as he warmed to the topic. "I want to protect people and serve my country." James's head snapped up at those words. They were almost identical to something he had told Kate during one of their conversations, back when his dreams of military service seemed impossibly distant. Catherine glanced over at James, including him in the conversation for the first time. "Well, Tommy, you're very fortunate. This is James, and he's a soldier who protects people every day. Maybe he could tell you a bit about what it's like." James felt his world tilt as Catherine's words put him in an impossible position. How could he talk to this boy about following his dreams without revealing his own story? How could he offer encouragement without sharing the fact that he had once been exactly where Tommy was now? But Tommy was looking at him with such hope and admiration that James knew he had to find a way. He stepped closer to the bed, his white gloves clasped behind his back, and chose his words carefully. "Tommy," he said quietly, "the most important thing about being a soldier is that it starts long before you put on a uniform. It starts with the battles you fight every day, right here in this bed. The courage you show in this hospital, the way you face each treatment, even when it's scary, that's what makes a real soldier." Tommy's eyes widened with interest. "Really? So I'm already kind of like a soldier?" "You're exactly like a soldier," James confirmed, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside him. "And when you're older and stronger, you'll have the foundation of courage that will make you the best kind of protector." Catherine was watching James with an expression of surprise and something deeper. recognition of the personal passion behind his words. She had expected professional courtesy, but what she was witnessing was something far more genuine and emotionally invested. As they prepared to leave Tommy's room, the boy reached out and grasped James's gloved hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something," Tommy said, echoing words that James remembered speaking himself all those years ago. "What's that?" James asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Promise me you'll remember that I want to be like you someday. Promise me you'll remember that I'm going to get better and be a soldier." James looked down at this brave little boy whose words were so perfectly echoing his own childhood plea to Kate and felt something break open in his chest. "I promise," he said solemnly. "I promise I'll remember, and I promise you're going to make an excellent soldier." Tommy smiled, the first real smile he had managed all day, and squeezed James's hand once more before letting go. As they left the room, Catherine fell into step beside James, her usual entourage trailing behind them. "That was beautifully done," she said quietly. "You have a natural way with the children. Have you spent much time in hospitals?" The question was innocent, born of genuine curiosity, but it felt like a lightning bolt to James. This was exactly the kind of personal territory he couldn't afford to explore with Catherine, but her perceptive nature was making it increasingly difficult to deflect her interest. "Some," he said carefully, falling back on the truth while revealing as little as possible, enough to understand what they're going through. Catherine nodded, apparently satisfied with that explanation, but James could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was too intelligent and too observant not to notice that his interaction with Tommy had been unusually personal and emotionally resonant. Their next stop was the children's library, a bright, cheerful space filled with books, comfortable reading nooks, and colorful murals on the walls. Several young patients were scattered throughout the room, some reading alone, others listening to volunteer readers who came in regularly to share stories. As Catherine moved through the library talking with children and volunteers, James found himself drawn to a particular corner where a teenage girl sat alone, reading what appeared to be a well-worn copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She was perhaps 14, thin from treatment, but with an intelligent, determined expression that reminded him powerfully of himself at that age. The girl looked up as James approached, her eyes widening slightly at his formal uniform. "Are you really a Royal Guard?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Scottish accent. "I am," James confirmed, glancing around to make sure Catherine was safely engaged with other patients and volunteers. "That's brilliant," the girl said with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm going to be in the military too, when I'm older. The RAF, I think. I want to be a pilot." James felt that familiar tug of recognition and connection. "That's an excellent goal. What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, closing her book but keeping one finger inside to mark her place. "What's yours?" "James," he said, surprising himself by offering his first name so readily. Something about Emma's direct manner and obvious intelligence made him want to engage with her as a person rather than just a representative of royal security. "James," Emma repeated thoughtfully. "That's a good, strong name for a soldier. Have you always wanted to be in the Queen's Guard?" "For a very long time," James said honestly. "Since I was about your age, actually." Emma's face lit up with interest. "Really? What made you decide?" James found himself at another crossroads, faced with a young person whose dreams and determination so perfectly mirrored his own teenage aspirations. How could he encourage her without revealing the personal experiences that had shaped his own path? "Someone once told me," he said carefully, "that the people who make the best protectors are those who understand what it feels like to need protection themselves. I think that's true for all kinds of service, military, medical, teaching. The best helpers are often those who have been helped." Emma considered this wisdom seriously. "So you think going through hard things makes you better at helping other people through hard things?" "I know it does," James said with more conviction than he intended. Their conversation was interrupted by Catherine's approach, her official duties having brought her to their corner of the library. Emma immediately straightened up, suddenly aware that she was in the presence of royalty. "Your Royal Highness," Emma said, attempting a small curtsy from her seated position. Catherine smiled warmly and sat down in a nearby chair, making herself accessible rather than towering over the girl. "Please, just Catherine is fine." "What are you reading?" Emma held up her book shyly. "Narnia. It's my favorite series." Catherine's face brightened with genuine delight. "Mine too. Which book is your favorite?" As the two began discussing the merits of different Narnia books, James stood nearby, his heart racing with the implications of their conversation. Catherine's love of Narnia was one of the first things Kate Middleton had shared with him in the hospital 15 years ago. She had been the one to introduce him to the series, reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe aloud during his most difficult treatments. Watching Catherine discuss these beloved books with Emma, seeing the same enthusiasm and deep emotional connection to the stories that had once comforted him, James felt the past and present colliding with overwhelming force. Every gesture, every expression, every inflection in Catherine's voice reminded him of those precious afternoons when Kate had transported him to Narnia, away from the pain and fear of his real circumstances. "The thing I love most about these stories," Catherine was saying to Emma, "is that they show how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're called upon to be brave." Every child who enters Narnia discovers that they're capable of more than they ever imagined. Emma nodded eagerly. Like how Lucy was the smallest, but she was often the bravest. Or how Edmund made terrible mistakes but found a way to be heroic in the end. Exactly, Catherine agreed. We all make mistakes, and we all have moments when we don't feel strong enough for what we're facing. But the stories remind us that bravery isn't about being perfect, it's about choosing to do what's right, even when it's difficult. James listened to this conversation with growing amazement, remembering almost identical words spoken by a 13-year-old Kate Middleton to a frightened boy who wasn't sure he would live to see Narnia's ending. The continuity between who Kate had been and who Catherine was now felt almost miraculous, as if the best parts of that young girl had grown and deepened without losing their essential kindness and wisdom. As their library visit came to an end, Emma stood up to shake Catherine's hand. "Thank you for talking with me about books," she said formally. "It's been brilliant." Catherine smiled and took the girl's hand warmly. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Emma. Keep reading, keep dreaming about flying, and remember that you're already braver than you know." As Emma turned to shake James's hand as well, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, on the back of Emma's right hand, was a small medical port, a device that allowed easy access for IV medications and blood draws. The skin around it was slightly scarred from repeated use, creating a pattern of small marks that would likely remain long after her treatment was complete. In that moment, James understood something profound about scars and healing, about the marks that difficult experiences leave on us and the ways those marks can become sources of strength rather than shame. His own scar, hidden beneath his white gloves, suddenly felt less like a secret to be protected and more like a badge of honor, proof that he had survived something difficult and emerged stronger. "Thank you for talking with me about being a soldier," Emma said to James. "I'll remember what you said about protectors understanding what it's like to need protection." James nodded solemnly. "And I'll remember your dream of becoming a pilot, Emma. The RAF will be lucky to have you." As they left the hospital later that afternoon, Catherine was unusually quiet during the drive back to London. James could see her processing the emotional weight of the visit, the stories she had heard, and the connection she had made with the young patients. Finally, she spoke. "James, can I ask you something personal?" James felt his pulse quicken, but nodded carefully. "Of course, Your Highness. Today, watching you with those children, with Tommy and Emma especially, I got the sense that this meant more to you than just professional duty. You spoke to them with such understanding, such genuine connection. I just wondered, have you spent time in a place like that yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that James couldn't fully address without revealing far more than he was prepared to share. Catherine's intuition had picked up on exactly what he had hoped to keep hidden, the personal resonance that the hospital visit had held for him. "Everyone has experiences that shape how they see the world," James said carefully. "I suppose today reminded me of why this work matters, not just protecting people from external threats, but understanding what it means to feel vulnerable and need someone to believe in you." Catherine studied his profile as he stared straight ahead through the car window. Something in his tone, in the careful way he had phrased his response, told her there was much more to the story than he was sharing. But she also recognized the boundaries of their professional relationship and the privacy that James clearly needed to maintain around whatever experiences had shaped his perspective. "Well," she said gently, "whatever has given you that understanding, it makes you remarkable at what you do. Those children responded to you in a way that was clearly personal, not just professional." "That's a gift." James nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. Catherine's praise, her recognition of the deeper currents running beneath his service, was both gratifying and terrifying. Every conversation brought them closer to territory that could expose everything he was working to keep hidden. That evening, alone in his quarters, James sat at his small desk and carefully removed his white gloves. The crescent-shaped scar on his right hand seemed to throb with memory and meaning after the day's events. He traced its outline slowly, remembering Tommy's courage, Emma's dreams, and Catherine's wisdom as she had spoken with the young patients. But most of all, he remembered Kate Middleton's voice reading to him from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, promising him that he would find his own way to Narnia, his own path to a life of meaning and service. Today, watching Catherine offer that same hope to a new generation of children, James finally understood that his promise had been fulfilled in ways Kate could never have imagined. He was serving his country, protecting someone he cared about deeply, and using his own experiences of vulnerability to better understand and serve others. The scared 13-year-old boy who had made that promise in a hospital bed had indeed become everything he had dreamed of being. But the irony remained painfully acute. He was protecting the woman who had saved him, serving someone who didn't know how profoundly she had already changed his life, and keeping his deepest gratitude locked away behind white gloves and professional protocol. James pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing, not a letter he would ever send, but a way of processing the complex emotions that the day had stirred up. He wrote about Tommy's courage and Emma's dreams, about Catherine's grace and compassion, and about the impossible situation of loving someone from a distance while being trusted with their safety. Most of all, he wrote about the weight of promises. The one Kate had asked him to make, the one he had made to himself about maintaining professional boundaries, and the new ones he felt forming in his heart, about protecting not just Catherine's physical safety, but the legacy of hope and healing she represented to so many people. As he sealed the letter away in his private papers, James made one more promise to himself. He would find a way to honor both the past and the present, to serve Catherine with complete dedication while keeping their shared history safely protected. He would be worthy of the trust she had placed in him, both as the 13-year-old who had believed in his future and as the princess who now depended on him for her security. The white gloves, he realized, weren't just hiding a scar anymore. They were protecting something far more precious. The space where gratitude, service, and love intersected in ways that could never be spoken aloud, but would forever define the nature of his devotion. The crisis came on a cold February morning, 6 months after the hospital visit that had shaken James's carefully constructed emotional walls. Catherine had been scheduled for a routine visit to a youth centre in South London, but as their convoy approached the destination, intelligence came through that changed everything. Possible security threat at the venue, the voice crackled through James's earpiece. Suspect with unknown intentions spotted in the area. All units proceed with extreme caution. James's training kicked in immediately. His hand moved to his radio as he leaned forward to speak with Catherine's driver. "We're diverting to the backup location," he said calmly, his voice betraying none of the adrenaline now coursing through his system. Catherine looked up from the briefing papers she had been reviewing. "What's happening?" "Just a precautionary measure, Your Highness," James replied, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as the convoy changed direction. "We're going to root through." The explosion came without warning, a devastating blast that ripped through a building just 2 blocks from their original destination. The shockwave rattled the windows of their armored car, and in the distance, they could see a column of black smoke rising into the grey London sky. Catherine's face went pale as the implications hit her. The youth centre? James was already on his radio, coordinating with police and security teams. The reports coming in were chaotic but increasingly clear.
A gas explosion had leveled part of the building where Catherine had been scheduled to appear.
Several injuries were reported, and emergency services were rushing to the scene. "Your Highness," James said, turning to face Catherine fully, "I need to get you to a secure location immediately. This appears to be accidental, but until we know for certain—" "No!" Catherine interrupted, her voice firm despite her obvious shock. "If people are hurt, if there are children injured, I need to help. The hospital is only 10 minutes from here." James felt his professional instincts warring with something deeper, a recognition of the person Catherine truly was, someone who would never prioritize her own safety over the welfare of others. It was exactly what Kate Middleton would have done. Exactly the kind of courage and compassion that had drawn a frightened 13-year-old boy to trust her completely. "Your Highness, my orders are to ensure your safety," James said carefully. "The protocol in this situation is clear." "Then change the protocol," Catherine said with quiet authority. "I'm not going to hide in a safe room while people who are expecting to see me are fighting for their lives. Take me to the hospital, James. That's where I need to be." The use of his first name, spoken with such trust and determination, broke through James's professional reserve in a way that formal commands never could. This was the same voice that had once told him he was braver than he knew. The same spirit that had refused to let fear or propriety prevent her from comforting frightened children. Against every security protocol he had been trained to follow, James made a decision that prioritized Catherine's character over her safety. "Driver, take us to St. Thomas's Hospital," he commanded. "We'll coordinate with emergency services en route." The hospital was in controlled chaos when they arrived. Ambulances were pulling up to the emergency entrance regularly, and medical staff were moving with the urgent efficiency that James remembered from his own medical crises. Catherine emerged from the car with purposeful grace, immediately approaching the senior physician who came out to meet them. "Doctor, I'm here to help however I can," she said simply. "Please don't treat me as a visiting dignitary. Just tell me where I can be most useful." James positioned himself strategically as Catherine was led inside, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, while his mind processed the security nightmare of protecting a high-profile target in an active emergency situation. Every protocol screamed at him that this was exactly the wrong place for Catherine to be, but every instinct told him this was exactly where she needed to be. For the next 4 hours, James watched Catherine transform from a royal princess into something far more fundamental, a human being responding to human need. She moved through the emergency department with remarkable skill, comforting families waiting for news, sitting with injured children, and somehow bringing calm to situations that seemed overwhelming. James had seen Catherine perform official duties many times, but this was different. This was personal, immediate, and completely authentic. Watching her work with the medical staff and families affected by the explosion, he was struck by how seamlessly she blended her royal training with something far more basic, the same instinctive compassion that Kate Middleton had shown to sick children 15 years ago. The most challenging moment came when they encountered a family whose 7-year-old son, Marcus, had been severely injured in the explosion. The boy was stable but facing multiple surgeries, and his parents were struggling with shock and fear. Marcus himself was conscious but traumatized, refusing to speak to anyone and withdrawing from all attempts at comfort. Catherine spent nearly an hour with the family, listening to the parents, talking quietly with the medical staff, and gradually working to establish some connection with Marcus. James watched from his security position, admiring her patience and skill, but also feeling the familiar ache of recognition. Finally, Catherine asked the parents if she could sit alone with Marcus for a few minutes. James moved closer as she settled into the chair beside the boy's bed. The same position she had taken with Tommy at the Manchester Children's Hospital, the same position Kate Middleton had taken beside his own hospital bed all those years ago. "Marcus," Catherine said softly, "I know you're scared. I know everything feels overwhelming right now, but I want to tell you something important. You're going to be okay." The boy looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his 7-year-old face. "How do you know?" he whispered. Catherine smiled gently. "Because I've met other brave children like you. Children who faced scary things and came through them stronger. And because sometimes, when we're most frightened, that's when we discover just how brave we really are." Marcus considered this for a long moment. Then, with the direct honesty that only children possess, he asked, "Were you ever scared when you were little?" Catherine's response came without hesitation. "Yes, I was. When I was about your age, I was in a hospital too, after an accident. I was scared and hurt, and I didn't know if everything would be okay." James felt his heart stop. Catherine was sharing something personal, something that connected directly to the experiences that had shaped both of their lives. He moved slightly closer, drawn by the intimacy of the moment despite every professional instinct telling him to maintain his distance. "What happened?" Marcus asked, his interest overcoming his fear. "I got better," Catherine said simply. "It took time, and it wasn't easy. But I got better. And while I was getting better, I met some very special people who helped me understand that being scared doesn't mean you're not brave." Marcus reached out tentatively and touched Catherine's hand where it rested on his bed cover. "Will you stay until I'm not scared anymore?" Catherine's eyes misted slightly as she looked down at the small hand touching hers. "I'll stay as long as I can," she promised. "And even when I have to go, I'll remember you, and I'll be proud of how brave you are." James watched this exchange with growing emotional turmoil. The parallels to his own hospital experience were so exact, so perfectly aligned, that he began to wonder if Catherine's presence at his bedside 15 years ago had been less coincidental than he had always assumed. Could she remember their time together? Could her decision to become involved with children's charities, her natural ease with young patients, be connected to those same formative experiences? As the afternoon wore on and the immediate crisis subsided, Catherine finally agreed to leave the hospital. The explosion had indeed been accidental, a gas leak that had caused a devastating but unintentional blast. The youth centre visit would be rescheduled, but Catherine's impromptu hospital work had created exactly the kind of positive story that the royal family needed during a difficult period. During the drive back to London, Catherine was unusually quiet, processing the emotional weight of the day. James could see her exhaustion, but also a kind of satisfaction that came from feeling genuinely useful during a crisis. "Thank you," she said finally, breaking the silence. James looked at her in confusion. "For what, Your Highness? For taking me to the hospital instead of a safe house. For understanding that sometimes the right thing to do and the safe thing to do are different things. For trusting my judgment even when it went against your training." James felt a wave of warmth at her words, but also a growing unease. Catherine's gratitude was making their professional relationship even more personal, pushing against boundaries that he was already struggling to maintain. "You were right to insist on going," he said carefully. "Those families needed you there." Catherine studied his profile in the dim light of the car. "James, can I ask you something that's been on my mind since the Manchester hospital visit?" James's pulse quickened, but he nodded. "That day, watching you with the children, I got the strong sense that you understood their situation from personal experience. And today, seeing you support my decision to go to the hospital even when it violated protocol, I realized that you understand something about service that goes deeper than training."
Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully.
"I keep feeling like there's more to your story than you've shared, and I want you to know that whatever it is, it only makes me trust you more completely." The question hung between them, loaded with implications that James couldn't fully address without revealing everything. Catherine wasn't directly asking him to break his professional boundaries, but she was offering him an opening to share more of himself if he chose to. James found himself at a crossroads that he had been approaching for months. He could continue to deflect Catherine's perceptive questions, maintaining his secrets and professional distance, or he could take the risk of revealing at least part of the truth, not about their shared past, but about the experiences that had shaped his dedication to service. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "I was a patient at Manchester Children's Hospital when I was 13. Leukemia. I spent 6 months there, and it changed how I see the world." Catherine's intake of breath was audible. "James, I had no idea. That must have been terrifying." "It was," James admitted, surprised by how good it felt to share even this much truth. "But it also taught me about courage, about the people who choose to help when others are most vulnerable. It's part of why I wanted to serve, why protecting people feels like more than just a job." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. "That explains so much about how you interact with people, especially children. You have such genuine empathy, such understanding of what it feels like to be scared and need protection." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had revealed more than he had intended, but Catherine's response was exactly what he should have expected. Compassion, understanding, and a deeper appreciation for his service, rather than any kind of professional judgment. "Thank you for trusting me with that," Catherine said softly. "I know it wasn't easy to share." As they pulled up to the palace, James felt both relief and renewed anxiety. He had shared part of his story, but the most important part, his connection to Catherine herself, remained hidden. If anything, her understanding response made him even more aware of how much he was still concealing from her. Over the following weeks, James noticed a subtle but significant change in his relationship with Catherine. She treated him with the same professional respect as before, but there was a new warmth, a deeper trust that acknowledged the personal experiences he had shared. She began asking for his opinion more frequently, including him in conversations about charity work and public engagements in ways that went beyond his security role. The situation came to a head during preparation for a major gala benefiting children's hospitals across the UK. Catherine was scheduled to give a keynote speech about the importance of hope and healing in pediatric care, and she had been working on the address for weeks. "James," she said one afternoon as he reviewed security arrangements for the event, "I wonder if I could ask your opinion on something." He looked up from his paperwork, immediately attentive. "I'm struggling with part of my speech," Catherine continued, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I want to talk about how children facing serious illness often show remarkable courage, but I'm concerned about sounding patronizing or overly sentimental. Given your experience, do you think there's a way to acknowledge that courage without minimizing the very real fear and difficulty these children face?" James set down his pen, recognizing the deeper significance of Catherine's request. She wasn't just asking for his opinion as a former patient. She was asking him to help her find language that would honor the experiences of children like his younger self. "The thing about courage in that situation," James said thoughtfully, is that it doesn't feel heroic when you're living it. It just feels like trying to get through each day, each treatment, each moment of fear. The children I knew, including myself, didn't feel brave. We felt scared and small and uncertain about our futures.
Catherine leaned forward, clearly engaged. So how do you acknowledge that reality while still celebrating their strength? Maybe, James suggested, by focusing on how courage isn't the absence of fear, it's continuing to hope and dream and connect with others despite the fear.
Bravest children I knew weren't the ones who claimed they weren't scared. They were the ones who admitted they were terrified but still found ways to laugh, to form friendships, to plan for futures they weren't sure they would see. Catherine's eyes brightened with understanding. Yes, exactly. It's about resilience rather than fearlessness. As they continued working on the speech together, James found himself sharing more details about his hospital experience than he had ever intended. He told her about the friendships he had formed with other patients, about the ways small acts of kindness from staff and volunteers had made enormous differences, and about the importance of treating young patients as complete human beings rather than just their diagnoses. Catherine listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that helped her understand not just the medical aspects of his experience, but the emotional and psychological dimensions as well. Her questions were thoughtful and respectful, never pushing for more detail than James was comfortable sharing. "There's something else," Catherine said as they neared the end of their working session. "I want to include a section about the people who help these children. Not just medical staff, but the volunteers, the family members, the friends who show up and provide hope when hope feels impossible. Do you have thoughts about how to describe that kind of impact?" James felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was dangerous territory, edging toward the very experiences that had connected him to Catherine in the first place. But her question was so genuine, so clearly motivated by a desire to honor the people who had made a difference in his life, that he found himself responding from the heart. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the people who make the biggest difference are the ones who just show up consistently. Not necessarily with grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but with small, repeated acts of presence and attention. Someone who reads to you when you're too sick to hold a book. Someone who listens to your fears without trying to talk you out of them. Someone who treats you like a whole person with dreams and interests, not just a patient with an illness." Catherine was taking notes as he spoke, but James could see that his words were affecting her on a deeper level. There was something in her expression, a flicker of recognition, a softening around her eyes, that made him wonder if his description was resonating with memories of her own. "That's beautiful," she said softly, "and so true. I remember," she paused, seeming to catch herself before sharing something personal. "I remember feeling that way about certain people when I was younger. The power of someone just being present, just believing in your future when you're not sure you have one." James's heart began beating faster. Catherine's words, her tone, the distant look in her eyes, everything suggested that she might be remembering their shared time at the hospital.
But how could he explore that possibility without revealing his own identity?
"Your Highness," he said hesitantly, "if you don't mind my asking, you seem to have a very personal understanding of what these children experience. Have you spent time in hospitals yourself?" Catherine looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing how much to share. "When I was 13, she said finally, I spent several weeks in a children's hospital. My brother had been injured in an accident, and I was there visiting him every day. It was my first real exposure to seriously ill children, and it changed my perspective on so many things." James felt the world shift around him. Catherine was describing their shared experience from her own perspective, remembering the same time and place that had shaped both of their lives. But she was describing it as time spent visiting her brother, not as a personal medical experience. "That must have been difficult," James managed to say, his voice carefully controlled, "seeing children facing such serious challenges." "It was," Catherine agreed, "but it was also inspiring. I met children who were facing unimaginable difficulties with such grace and determination, and I learned that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is just be present with someone, to sit with them in their fear and uncertainty, and remind them that they're not alone."
James was struggling to process the implications of Catherine's words.
She clearly remembered the hospital, remembered the impact it had on her perspective and her later charity work. But did she remember him specifically? Had their connection been significant enough from her perspective to create lasting memories, or had he been just one of many patients she had encountered during that time? "Did you stay in touch with any of the children you met?" James asked. the question carrying far more personal weight than Catherine could possibly understand. Catherine's smile grew sad and wistful. For a while, yes. There was one boy in particular who made a deep impression on me. He was about my age, facing leukemia with such courage and determination. We became friends during the time I was there, and we exchanged letters for several months after I left. James felt his heart stop. Catherine was remembering him, remembering their friendship, remembering the connection that had meant so much to both of them. "What happened to him?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost touch with him eventually," Catherine said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "I always wondered if he recovered, if he achieved his dreams of military service. I hoped so. He was one of the bravest people I've ever met, and he taught me so much about resilience and hope." The moment hung between them, loaded with recognition and possibility. James could feel Catherine's eyes on him, studying his face with growing attention. Her intelligence and intuitive nature were working to connect the dots between the story she had just shared and the man sitting across from her. "James," she said slowly, her voice carrying a note of wonder and uncertainty. "How old did you say you were when you were at Manchester Children's Hospital?" James met her eyes directly, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. 13, Your Highness. I was 13. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a growing certainty that transformed her features completely. "The boy who wanted to be a soldier," she whispered. "The one who loved military history. The one who made me promise to remember his dreams." James nodded slowly, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of 15 years of hidden truth. "Kate," he said softly, using her old name for the first time since they had been reunited. "You kept your promise. You remembered." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as the full implications of their reunion hit her. "All this time," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "all these months of wondering why you seemed so familiar, why your dedication felt so personal. You've been protecting me, and I never knew I was being protected by the boy whose life you saved," James finished quietly. "Not medically. The doctors did that. But in every way that mattered, you saved me. You gave me hope when I had none. You made me believe in my future when I couldn't see past the next treatment, and you asked me to promise to become the person I am today." Catherine stood up suddenly, moving around the desk to where James sat. Without hesitation, she reached out and gently took his hands, still gloved in their ceremonial white. "May I?" she asked softly, indicating the gloves. James hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Catherine carefully removed first one glove, then the other, revealing the hands that had remained hidden from her for so many months. When she saw the crescent-shaped scar on his right hand, the perfect match to her own, she drew in a sharp breath of recognition. "The blood draw that went wrong," she said, touching her own scar unconsciously. "When my ring pressed into your skin, I've carried the mark of your kindness for 15 years, James said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Every day, every moment of service, every time I've faced a challenge, I've remembered the girl who held my hand and made me promise to be brave." Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full circle of their connection became clear. "And you became everything you promised to become. You kept your word, James. You became the protector you dreamed of being." James looked down at their joined hands, his scarred, hers scarred, both marked by the same moment of connection 15 years ago. "I couldn't tell you," he said softly. "I couldn't compromise your safety or my position by revealing a personal connection. But serving you, protecting you, it's been the honor of my lifetime. Getting to repay even a fraction of what you gave me when we were children." Catherine shook her head firmly. "You don't owe me anything, James. What we shared in that hospital was mutual. 2 children helping each other through a difficult time. But what you've given me as my protector, the way you've understood and supported my work with children, the depth of care you've shown, that's gift beyond measure." They stood together in the quiet office, hands joined, the professional distance that had defined their relationship, finally bridged by the truth of their shared past and the recognition of how it had shaped their present. "What happens now?" James asked, uncertain how this revelation would change the fundamental dynamics of his role as Catherine's protector. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "Now," she said finally, "we continue exactly as we have been, You continue to be the exceptional protection officer you've always been, and I continue to be the person who trusts you completely with my safety. The only difference is that now I understand why our working relationship has felt so natural, so right from the very beginning. She paused, looking directly into his eyes. And now I know that when I asked you to promise to remember your dreams, I was unknowingly asking you to remember me too. And you have, James. In the most beautiful way possible, you've remembered. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The secret that had defined his service for so many months was finally revealed, but instead of creating the complications he had feared, it had brought a deeper understanding and trust between them. "I'll never remove my gloves again during official duties," James said, beginning to put them back on. "The professional boundaries remain important." Catherine smiled, helping him adjust the white gloves with the same gentle care she had once shown a frightened 13-year-old. "But now I know what's underneath them. Now I know that my protector carries the mark of our first meeting, and that every day he chooses to serve with hands that remember being held when comfort was most needed." As James resumed his formal posture and Catherine returned to her desk, the office seemed to hold a new energy, not romantic or inappropriate, but deeply meaningful in ways that transcended professional duty. They had both discovered that the connection they felt was rooted in something far deeper than immediate attraction or workplace compatibility. They were two people whose lives had been shaped by a moment of mutual care and courage, who had grown into adults dedicated to service and protection, and who had found their way back to each other through the mysterious workings of fate and dedication to something larger than themselves. The gala speech, when Catherine delivered it 2 weeks later, was perhaps the most powerful address she had ever given. Her words about courage and hope, about the people who provide comfort to frightened children, and about the lasting impact of small acts of kindness resonated with an authenticity that moved the audience to tears. James stood at his usual position during the speech, professionally alert but privately proud, as he listened to Catherine articulate truths they had both lived. When she spoke about the volunteers and friends who show up for children in hospitals, who read stories and hold hands and promise that dreams are worth pursuing, James knew she was speaking directly from their shared experience. And when Catherine concluded her speech with a tribute to the brave children who grow up to become protectors themselves, who transform their own experiences of vulnerability into strength that serves others, James understood that she was acknowledging him as publicly as their positions would allow. After the gala, as they rode home through the London night, Catherine turned to James with a smile that held echoes of the 13-year-old girl who had once brightened a sick child's day. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what, Your Highness? For keeping your promise, for becoming exactly who you said you would become. And for showing me that the best kind of service comes from people who remember what it felt like to need protection themselves." James nodded, his white gloves resting carefully in his lap, covering scars that were no longer secrets but were instead symbols of a connection that had shaped two lives in the most beautiful way possible. Outside the car windows, London passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, but inside their protected space, two people who had found each other twice, once as children needing comfort and once as adults choosing service, traveled home together, their professional relationship forever strengthened by the personal history they finally shared.